It might be ready to start the keynote speech, so I would like to introduce our esteemed keynote speakers. So first, we are honored to have a keynote address from James Bacchus, a distinguished university professor of global affairs at the University of Central Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming him with a big round of applause to the podium.
Good morning, and my apologies for not speaking Korean. I do, however, speak Gat, which along the way has gotten me into a lot of trouble, but it's a bit too late for me to hide that fact, especially back home in the United States. I am honored and delighted to have been asked to be here today and to deliver these remarks, although he could not join us because he is, as usual, working hard for his country. I would like to thank Minister An for inviting me here for this conference. For those of you who are working with him, I will hope that you will tell him how very proud I am of him for all he has accomplished for his country and the world since the days nearly 30 years ago when I was a member of the appellate body and he was our very first intern. I also want to thank Chairman Dean Professor Lee for his hospitality. I'd like to thank the Vice Minister Chow Nam-o as well for his kind words, all those at Modi for this invitation, and I'd like lastly to thank all of you in the audience for your presence and attention. I will do my best to try to be sufficiently provocative to encourage a lively exchange over the rest of the day. This is not an easy time to be a trade administrator anywhere in the world. As I think Alexis will explain to us later today, trade remedies are once again rising significantly. Anti-dumping investigations, countervailing duty investigations, safeguard measures as well. And we see this in the recent headlines. In May, my own country announced that it was imposing tariffs of 100% on imports of electric vehicles from China. On June 12th, the European Union announced tariffs of 38% on EV imports from China. On June 16th, China launched a trade investigation of dozens of imports of pork products from the European Union. Against a backdrop of a widening proliferation of trade remedies worldwide, we see more and more such examples. Last week, India announced an investigation of imports of glass fiber from several countries. The previous week, Indonesia announced safeguard duties of between 100 and 200% on imports of footwear, textiles, clothing, and ceramics, and so on. This is high season for trade remedies, even as the world seems to be turning its collective backs on trade cooperation multilaterally. Let me be clear in my own views. Dumping is condemned in the GATT. That's actually the word that's used. Governmental subsidies can be counterbilled, and in many instances should be. And safeguards are permissible in certain circumstances, even though they are imposed without any evidence of any unfair trade practice. This is all what we call in the legal world black letter law. These are obvious statements, but I think they're worth reiterating because I am not someone who has urged the proliferation of these kinds of remedies. All of them are politically attractive, as well as being perfectly legal when applied within the rules in the competition for growth in a low-growth world. The problem is this: trade remedies do not create growth. Trade liberalization does. And there is very little impetus today for further trade liberalization. In fact, the world is turning away from freer trade and toward more trade protection. There are very few conferences on trade liberalization in 2024. Now, I do not see the application of trade remedies necessarily as a form of trade protection, even over and above the fact that when done within the rules, they are perfectly legal. However, to the extent that the even-handed application of both domestic and international rules relating to trade remedies is hijacked by interested parties seeking what amount to favored handouts from governments and to the political agendas of various politicians in various political parties, what trade remedies produce is tantamount to protectionism. And that is precisely what must be avoided if we want to encourage global economic growth. I should emphasize, while at this point in my life I am indeed an academic and proud to be one, I have not always been one. The program mentions my 8 years on the appellate body of the WTO, but prior to that I was a member of the Congress of the United States. And before that I was a trade negotiator for the United States. So my interest in trade is not purely academic or ethereal. I've actually been in the reality of trade in the day-to-day doings of commerce and of politics relating to commerce. I have sought public office. I've been elected and re-elected to public office. I have never lost an election. I am not naive about trade or much of anything else in politics, and I know that trade can never be separated from politics anywhere in the world. nor can it be separated from politics at a time of economic stress. When, despite all the evidence of decades that freer trade is good for all of us, there is everywhere the temptation to turn away from trade and impose trade barriers of all kinds, some of them legal, some not. I have the letters WTO tattooed on my forehead. When I'm speaking in the United States, those letters shine especially, and are luminous in the darkest of rooms. So you will not be surprised to hear that I am an ardent advocate for the World Trade Organization and for the multilateral WTO-based trading system. This is one reason I'm so happy that Alexis is here today to represent the WTO. And he is not representing the Secretariat, he is representing 166 countries that have come together to form and to sustain the WTO. And our biggest challenge in trade in the world today is indeed sustaining the WTO. More than that, we must strengthen it. But that does not seem to be very high on the agenda of any country. WTO rules are increasingly ignored through the application of unilateral trade measures that are entirely inconsistent with WTO rules. I believe my own country has up until now been the worst sinner in this respect, but there are others. The rules are increasingly ignored. And here I'm not talking about trade remedies per se, I'm talking about trade measures of all kinds, many of which are applied by legislative bodies and not by professional administrators. This trend has been facilitated by the undermining of the WTO dispute settlement system, which has been done, alas, largely by my own country. Here, too, I'm not talking about administrators, professionals who are trying to comply with the law and do their job in the appropriate way. I'm talking about the politicians, the elected officials who seem to care less and less about what the rules say, including those that govern the WTO dispute settlement system. Now is not the time or place, and today is not the day for an extended defense of the record of the WTO appellate body. Suffice it to say that the appellate body has basically been accused by the United States of doing its job as it has been instructed to do it in the WTO dispute settlement understanding. Of this, it is guilty. I would not claim perfection for any legal tribunal anywhere in the world, at any time in the world, and certainly not the appellate body. But I would suggest, and sad to say, I think what I'm about to say is reinforced by events judicially in my own country in the past several days, that the appellate body has done a much better job of doing what it's supposed to do than has the Supreme Court of the United States. Enough on dispute settlement, though. You have identified two issues, two very important issues, on which you want to deliberate today, and I think there are appropriate issues for your deliberation, because there's no way to escape these issues, either economically or politically. One is the issue of economic security. As a legal matter, under WTO rules, the appropriate phrase is national security. What does it mean? When is it justified to apply some type of trade restriction for reasons of national security? Based on the discussions that I'm hearing, not only in the United States, but elsewhere as well, increasingly there are those who are saying that economic security, national security can justify almost any kind of trade restriction. The import of a BMW from Germany into the United States has been said to pose a problem under national security. That's one example. Here, too, I would emphasize that I'm not naive. I understand the economic competition in the world that's ongoing and intensifying. I know that on the cutting edge of technology, there are many geopolitical considerations. I am not naive. But we cannot simply permit anything and everything to be justified by invoking the phrase economic security or national security. Down that road lies economic autarky, and down that road lies economic decline. It was with that realization that we created first the GATT and then the WTO and have sustained them all these years. As I put it in one of the essays I have written, the national security exception in the GATT, Article 21, can become a legal black hole if we allow it to be. Ideally, we would not be having international disputes and dispute settlement over these kinds of issues, but here we are. And I believe we need negotiations within the WTO to help draw the right lines between what is an appropriate national security measure and what is not. I was looking some time back through the ancient annals of the GATT, back in the first few years after its formation in the aftermath of the Second World War. This is even before there were working parties, which, as you know, later evolved into panels. There was a discussion before the General Council between two of the contracting parties, as they were called then. One member wanted to impose restrictions on imports of shoes from another member. Their justification that they offered was one of national security. They said, our army and its soldiers need shoes, and there may come a time when we might not be able to import shoes. So we need to make certain that we produce a lot of shoes ourselves. At that time, more than 70 years ago, reading between the lines of the report, this country was basically laughed out of the room. But now this issue is no laughing matter because it is invoked in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of proceedings. And I fear that this exception that is in the covered agreements could expand to the point where it swallows up a vast number of what ought to be obligations. You can discuss this issue yourselves this afternoon. The second issue you've identified is overcapacity. This too is a real issue, and it's a burning political question as well. And here we have an omission in the WTO rules. We have rules on short supply. We do not have any rules on oversupply. Why is this? As best I can tell, it's because in the first couple of years after the Second World War, no one involved in trade negotiations could imagine a situation in which there would be oversupply of any goods. There was such a shortage in the aftermath of the war because of the devastation of that military conflict. Here, I think we need not to engage in another spate of trade measures and trade disputes, as legitimate as some of the restrictions might turn out to be under the existing rules. I think rather we should be negotiating on drawing new lines about where here, several decades into the 21st century, the lines should be. And so I encourage all of you to think in those terms as you prepare to deliberate about this issue this afternoon. Lastly, I want to say this. Looking back to 30 years ago, because I had been a trade negotiator at USTR before I came to the Congress, even though I was a junior member of the House of Representatives, I was drafted by the senior members into the efforts to approve trade legislation from the first day I got there. As the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee put it to me during my first week in the Congress, you've actually read the GATT. So it was thought that I might be able to explain it to others. I've been trying to do that ever since. So I became one of the 6 original co-sponsors in the House of the implementing legislation in the United States for the Uruguay round trade agreements. And then shortly after I decided not to seek a third term in the Congress, I was nominated by my country to become one of the 7 founding members of the appellate body. And here I want to pause and thank the government of Korea for supporting both my nomination and my renomination in that role. Then 30 years ago, we had vast hopes for the trading system. I don't think we were overly idealistic. I think what we hoped for can still be accomplished, despite all our current travails. But now, where once there were hopes, there seem to be mostly apprehensions. Will the appellate body ever be restored? Will the United States, if the political wheel turns in a certain way, withdraw from the WTO? Will countries continue to retreat from the WTO and the multilateral trading system into a never-ending number of regional trade agreements? We don't know the answers to those questions. But those of us who deal with trade and understand the stakes from trade, which are the stakes of freedom, look forward to a day when there will be conferences not only on trade remedies, but once more on trade liberalization, and when there will be true negotiations on lowering barriers to trade, and not only on the best ways of imposing new barriers to trade, even when such barriers are legally justified. We must be able to do both at the same time. To do this, I think, politically, throughout the world, we must return the WTO to where it belongs, rightly, in the center of world trade. We must comply with all WTO rules. We must uphold the rule of law in trade by complying with all WTO rules and by upholding them in dispute settlement, because the alternative to the rule of law in trade is the rule of power. And this is not an opportunity we should pursue. It is an alternative that leads downward into political and economic decline for everyone. We should also apply trade remedies, of course, fairly and within the rules, as I know you all try your best to do. Furthermore, we should negotiate new rules and new concessions that are needed for further trade liberalization. In an era of slow growth, the best and quickest way we could provide a spark for new growth would be by giving a tax cut to the entire world in the form of reduced tariffs on thousands of traded products. If we do all these things, then our hope can be justified, our apprehensions can be alleviated, and the world and all within it can prosper. Thank you so much.